They didn't kill me. They erased me. That was the first thing Rhett understood when he woke up in the transport cage, his wrists bound by scorched plasma chains, and the sky above him no longer blue, but a shifting violet storm that growled like a living thing. Earth was gone. So was his rank, his cause, his people. All that remained was the number etched into the cuff at his neck. 231 Gladiator class. Sentenced to varying ease. The dropship roared as it descended into the heart of the arena world, its belly opening to reveal the spires of the Colosseum below. It was called the Temple of the Old Gods, a place where thousands of beings from across the galaxy screamed for blood, not in reverence, but for spectacle. Rhett had heard rumors during the occupation wars about the Varyonese pits, the gladiator farms, the Thalcor who ran it all like gods playing dice with lives. Now he was a piece on their board. 2 guards hauled him out, both at least 8 feet tall, armored in obsidian exoframes that hummed with embedded AI. Rhett's boots scraped against the metal walkway as he was dragged toward the intake chambers. Other prisoners watched from behind energy barriers, some with pity, most with apathy. 1 or 2 laughed. No one lasted long in the first fight. Inside the prep cell, a voice greeted him, metallic and cold. Gladiator 0231. No name, no nation, no past. Your designation is flesh. You enter the arena in 180 seconds. No weapons provided. Kill, survive, or entertain. The walls vibrated with the sound of the crowd beyond. Rhythmic chanting. Blood drums. Alien languages morphing into one universal demand. Flesh. 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 Rhett cracked his neck. They erased his name, but not the memory of war, of surviving years on hostile colonies with nothing but a spade and a stolen rifle. He counted heartbeats. Measured the sounds. The distance from gate to sand. The angle of light breaking through the top of the dome. When the gate dropped, he walked into fire. The arena was vast, sunlit, and open to the roaring sky. Its floor was a blend of synthetic stone and blood-soaked soil. Bones littered the edges. And waiting across from him, rising from a mechanical hatch, was the thing he had to kill, a creature bred for slaughter. It stood nearly 3 meters tall, part lizard, part machine, with serrated plating along its spine and optic implants that glowed red. A design of biological terror and technological cruelty. It hissed, snapping twin jaws, and sprinted forward with terrifying speed. Rhett didn't run. He sidestepped, narrowly avoiding a claw that could shear steel. Dust kicked up around him, momentarily blinding the sensors in the creature's face. Rhett remembered the reports Varyonese creatures had enhanced vision, but relied heavily on direct sunlight. If he could blind it. He moved again, baiting it toward the east edge, where the light from Varyonese's twin suns slashed across at a hard angle. As the beast turned, it caught the glare directly into its exposed lenses. It screeched, staggered. Rhett lunged. No weapons? Fine. He used his weight to climb its arm, driving his elbow into a sensory node behind its eye, then wrapped his arms around its jaws. With a roar of fury and survival, Rhett pulled. The jaws gave under the pressure, sinew tearing, metal cracking. The crowd went silent for a breath and then erupted. He stood above the corpse, chest heaving, arms slick with blood, and looked up. That's when he saw her. Among the screaming masses, one figure was still. A woman, dressed not as a spectator but as a prisoner, yet there was something regal about the way she stood. Her face was striking high cheekbones, long dark hair that fell in midnight waves, and eyes like molten silver. They glowed. She didn't cheer. didn't flinch. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment Rhett felt something neither alien nor familiar. Recognition. Not of the face, but of the fire. Later he would learn her name. Aelira. Once, she had led a rebellion on Levin, her home world. Once, she had been hope. Now, she was catalogued as Asset 77A. A failed symbol turned captive, paraded in the shadows to remind others that resistance ends in chains. But in that brief second, as the blood of the beast dripped from his fingers and the weight of the crowd bore down like a sun, he felt her watching. Not as prey. Not as foe. As witness. And something inside him refused to stay erased. They built a theater out of blood, and taught the crowd to applaud every time a soul was severed. The halls beneath the temple of the old gods reeked of iron, ozone, and despair. The arena above may have been majestic, carved with ancient patterns and pulsing with artificial daylight, but down here, the bones of the place showed its purpose: containment, control, and spectacle. The passageways were narrow, lined with shock tile flooring and surveillance nodes embedded in the walls, blinking in quiet vigilance. The Thalcor did not leave anything to chance. They had fused archaic cruelty with modern tyranny. Rhett moved through one of the holding corridors, flanked by two drones armed with plasma lances. His arms still ached from the previous battle, but worse than the bruises was the knowledge that he was still alive and therefore still useful to them. The fight had bought him time, not freedom. They let him into a holding cell built from trans steel. Not bars, no, those were too primitive. The Thalcor preferred invisible cages. The door vanished behind him with a hiss of ionized air. Inside were three other prisoners. The first sat hunched in a corner, his beard gray and wild, eyes sharp behind a cracked lens visor. He looked like a man who'd once known comfort and lost it decades ago. The daytop hat parts scattered near him suggested a former life of design, not destruction. "You the new show pony," the old man rasped. "Still got the scent of victory on you. It'll wash off. Or bleed out." "Name's Rhett," he replied. "Not anymore. They don't care who you were. But I'm Thorn. Used to build security matrices for starports. Now I fix food dispensers and make makeshift bombs from grooming kits." In the opposite corner, another figure leaned against the wall. Taller than Rhett, even sitting, with a missing left arm and a gaze that drilled into Rhett like a targeting system. "Kale," the one-armed man said without invitation. "Don't think I owe you kindness. You stole my kill out there. That thing was meant for me." Rhett didn't rise to the bait. "I didn't see your name on it." Kale snorted. "Keep talking. You won't wake up next time you sleep." Thorn raised a hand. "Kale, sit your one-armed ass down. We need him alive." "Says who?" Before either could escalate, a soft voice cut through the tension. "Says the system. And the system watches us all." The voice came from the farthest cell space, dimly lit. A girl sat cross-legged on the floor, her skin a pale lavender, eyes large and luminous. She couldn't have been older than 15 in human years, though her features were unmistakably alien, delicate, symmetrical, with a faint glow under her skin. She watched them not with fear, but with the cool detachment of someone cataloging danger. "That's Vixa," Thorn said, lowering his voice. "Don't let the size fool you. She sees everything. Doesn't speak much. Hasn't fought yet, but I reckon the day she does, something's going to break." Rhett met her gaze, gave a nod. She returned it, then looked away. Time passed. Minutes. Hours. There was no sun down here, only artificial light that dimmed and brightened in random intervals. Rhett learned that the cells rearranged themselves nightly, like pieces on a board. It made escape planning almost impossible. The sound came without warning, a soft hiss of air and a pulse through the floor. Everyone stood. A new cell door appeared. Open. Kale moved first, fast, toward Rhett. Rhett spun, catching the movement too late. Kale tackled him into the wall, his knee pressing into Rhett's ribs. With his good arm, Kale produced a shiv made from fractured armor plating. "You think you're clever?" Kale snarled. "Think they'll make you their hero? You're just meat, same as the rest of us." Rhett tried to twist free, but the angle was wrong. The blade pressed near his throat. And then Kale froze. There was a low hum. A different energy in the air. Kale's body jerked back as if struck by lightning. He collapsed, twitching, unconscious. Behind him stood a figure Rhett hadn't seen enter. Aelira. She wore a different uniform now, not the simple prisoner rags, but a dark combat suit, sleek and etched with patterns of circuitry. Her hair was tied back, face stern, eyes still glowing. She held a stun rod. And she looked bored. "He was annoying," she said simply. Rhett stood, catching his breath. "Thanks." "Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you." He frowned. "Then why?" Her eyes locked on his. "Because I need you alive. And I need you angry." She stepped closer, voice low. "This place, this arena, this system, it's a lie covered in blood and broadcasted as truth. I used to believe in changing it from outside. Now I know better. We bring it down from within." Rhett narrowed his gaze. "Why me?" Aelira smirked, just slightly. "Because you fought like someone who had nothing left to lose. That makes you dangerous. And useful." Before he could respond, she was gone, vanishing into the next corridor as silently as she came. Thorn let out a low whistle. "Well, that was interesting." Rhett looked down at Kale's unconscious body, then at the empty corridor. Something had shifted. Not just in the structure of their cell blocks, but in the air. In the pulse of the place. The gods of this arena had built their prison well. But Rhett had just seen their cracks. They thought putting two beasts in a cage would end in blood. They never imagined fire. Rhett stood in the center of the arena once more, his boots sinking slightly into the hot, compacted soil. Above him, the twin suns of Varianese blazed with merciless intensity, and the sky roared with the thunder of 1,000 voices. The temple of the old gods had reached capacity. Banners waved from towers, and holographic projections of the combatants flickered in midair. His face loomed over the heads of the crowd, sharp with sweat and shadow. But across from him, her image was even more haunting. Aelira. They had taken her from the deep cells that morning, escorted by drones and guards as if she were a nuclear device about to detonate. Her hands were unshackled, but her presence was restrained in other ways, the tension in her jaw, the calculated distance in her eyes. Rhett watched her walk across the arena with the calm of someone who had stared into the abyss and grown used to its gaze. He didn't need to guess what they were doing. This was a spectacle. Two rising legends, two unbroken fighters, pitched against each other. The crowd expected carnage. Betrayal. A kill. And somewhere behind that expectation, Rhett could feel it, a guiding hand. Someone pulling strings. The announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum in multiple languages, calling them the Dual Flame. A title branded for show. Cameras swiveled. Spectators leaned forward. Bets were placed. Aelira approached him slowly, the sun glinting off her dark armor. Her eyes met his. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice calm. "Define this?" Rhett muttered. She moved closer. "We have 60 seconds to make them believe we're about to kill each other. Then the gate opens." He nodded once. They began. Rhett lunged first, a wide arc of motion meant to draw attention. Aelira countered, spinning around him, landing a glancing kick to his ribs. The crowd roared. Dust flared around them, kicking up like smoke in the heat. They moved in tandem, bodies colliding, fists flying with theatrical precision. To the crowd, it was war. To them, it was dance. Between the strikes, they whispered. "Gate opens northeast. 30 seconds. You still injured?" "Only my pride." Then came the roar from below. The ground split open with mechanical groans, and from the pit emerged a nightmare of bioengineering, a creature with 6 legs, armored plates, and a triple-hinged jaw dripping acid. Its eyes glowed green. The beast shrieked, its cry loud enough to silence even the crowd. Aelira and Rhett turned in perfect sync. "You go high," she whispered. "You go fast," he answered. They moved. Rhett bolted left, drawing the creature's attention. It charged him, its legs tearing furrows into the dirt. He dove, rolled, and came up beside the gate's support beams. With practiced skill, he ripped loose a metal rod and turned just in time to slam it across the monster's snout. It reeled, and Aelira was already on it. She vaulted onto its back, jamming a shiv into the joint between 2 plates. Acid sprayed, and the creature shrieked, twisting violently. Aelira was thrown, but Rhett caught her mid-fall, using her momentum to pivot her behind cover. They both landed in a crouch, breathing hard. "You good?" "Still breathing." The creature came again, enraged. Rhett threw the rod like a spear. It caught the beast in the eye. As it screamed, Aelira sprinted forward, vaulted once more, and slammed her second blade deep into its exposed neck tissue. The beast collapsed, twitching. Blood and acid soaked the dirt. And the arena went absolutely silent. Then came the cheers. Deafening. Relentless. Screams from 1,000 mouths. Symbols of Rhett and Aelira lit up in holographic fire across the sky. The announcer declared it the rise of the fire bond. Rhett stared upward, sweat stinging his eyes. They were branding him. Turning him into something. He looked at Aelira. She was breathing hard, eyes darting across the crowd. "Why do I feel like we just lost something?" he asked. She shook her head. "Because we did. Control. Anonymity. We're not weapons anymore. We're icons." As they were led back to the undercells, Rhett couldn't shake the feeling. Every drone lens hovered a little longer. Every step echoed with the weight of orchestration. "Someone wanted this," he muttered. Aelira didn't answer. She didn't need to. Somewhere high above the arena, past the screaming crowds and the fire-lit sky, someone had pulled the strings. And Rhett Cade was no longer just a man. He was a story. One they had started without his permission. There is something worse than a cage. It's when the one who built it is someone who once loved you. The next morning, the lights in the cell block did not rise with the usual jolt. Instead, a crimson hue coated the halls, and the air buzzed with a low hum that felt almost like a whisper. Rhett sat awake already, his back to the wall, watching Aelira from across the room. She hadn't moved in hours. Not since they were brought back from the arena. The door to their cell opened without warning. Guards. 4 of them, dressed in ceremonial exosuites with gold-veined armor and visors shaped like bird skulls. Not the usual drones. They took Aelira. Rhett rose instinctively, fists clenched, but the guards ignored him. One spoke with a voice that sounded synthesized and hollow. "The warden summons her?" Warden. That was a new term. They'd never heard it used before. An hour passed. Then 2. Then the cell opened again, and Aelira returned, but not as she left. She walked slowly, her shoulders tight, her face drained of all color. She didn't speak. Not even when Rhett stood and moved toward her. What happened? She shook her head once. Don't ask. But the next day, the answer came anyway. They were led into a chamber not part of the regular arena network. It was vast and circular, with floating monitors and walls of shifting metal. In the center stood a throne. Not ornamental, but functional, part machine, part control hub. And in it sat a figure neither holy man nor holy machine. Terrell Voss. He was tall, elegant, and grotesque in equal measure. One half of his face was still human, pale skin, high cheekbone, eyes like ice. The other half had been replaced by dark alloy and fiber optics that pulsed with energy. His left hand was skeletal metal. His voice, when it came, was smooth, warm, and hideously familiar. Aelira. Rhett. Welcome. Rhett instinctively placed himself slightly in front of Aelira. Terrell smiled. How noble. What do you want? Rhett asked. Clarity, Terrell said. Understanding. And perhaps, a moment of honesty. He rose from the throne. The way he moved was uncanny, fluid, almost graceful, but punctuated with mechanical precision. He circled them slowly, like a sculptor inspecting his own flawed work. I once believed in Aelira. Fiercely. I loved her more than my own species. More than my own future. When she called for rebellion, I followed. When she called for peace, I listened. But then, she called for chaos. For destruction. And I could not follow her there. Aelira's jaw clenched. You betrayed me for power. I chose order, Terrell said. You chose fire. He returned to his throne, sitting with regal ease. But now, look. Here we are again. The two of you, rising stars in my theater. The people love you. They see defiance, strength, devotion. Rhett's voice was like stone. They see what you let them see? Exactly, Terrell replied. And that's why I brought you here. I don't want to kill you. That would be wasteful. I want you to shine. Burn. Become Miss. The gods of this new age. He paused. The light dimmed, and the holographic walls flickered, showing scenes of Rhett and Aelira fighting side by side. Then embracing in brief moments of exhaustion. Then leading other fighters. It was already happening. The galaxy doesn't need hope, Terrell said softly. It needs a story it can consume. They were dismissed with the same mechanical grace. Rhett held Aelira's arm as they walked, but she pulled away, silent. Back in the cell, darkness settled. Rhett leaned against the wall, watching her. You okay? She didn't answer. You knew him, he said. I love him, she whispered. I thought he could help build something better. We dreamed of changing it all. She sank to the floor. Rhett joined her, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the silence. Now he wants to turn you into a weapon, Rhett said. Not just me, Aelira replied. Us. He reached for her hand, hesitant. She didn't pull away. In the faint glow of the cell wall, they sat close. No battle, no audience. Only breath and the weight of what might come. They can brand us, Rhett said. Broadcast us. But they don't own us. Aelira looked at him, really looked, as if seeing past the fighter, the prisoner, the rebel. You still believe that? He nodded. If I didn't, I'd already be dead. She leaned in. There was no hunger, no desperation. Only recognition. Their lips met, quiet and still. Not because of lust. But because, for a moment, they remembered who they were. And who they refused to become. To topple an empire, you must make it collapse under the weight of its own glory. They gathered in the darkness beneath the arena, where the air tasted of rust and old ash. Rhett stood beside Aelira, Thorn crouched over a blueprint projected from a hack node, and 3 other fighters hovered nearby, each one scarred, tired, but burning with something that hadn't existed before, purpose. The grand event is 5 days from now, Thorn said, pointing at a section of the map. This is the broadcasting nexus. Everything passes through it: live feeds, data packets, AI controls, even beast behavior modulation. We hit this, we don't just break the show. We break the illusion. Rhett folded his arms. And what about security? Tight. Automated drones, biometric gates, proximity mines. But nothing is unbreakable if you know where the cracks are. Aelira nodded. We won't get a second chance. If we're seen, it's over. We do this fast, quiet, and together. Kale stood in the shadows, arms crossed. And if someone sells us out? No one answered. The plan moved into motion over the next 3 days. Under the guise of routine training, they smuggled pieces of equipment, bribed minor tech overseers, and mapped the guard shifts with precision. Vixa, small and silent, proved invaluable, slipping through tight access vents to install bypass loops in the surveillance net. The night before the event, they moved. The sky above Varianese was ablaze with anticipation. Banners unfurled, hover screens displayed countdowns in over 100 languages, and the city around the arena pulsed like a living beast. But beneath it all, shadows stirred. Rhett, Aelira, Thorn, Kale, and Vixa slipped through a tunnel once used for maintenance bots. The path twisted upward, eventually opening into the underbelly of the Nexus control spire. Machinery hummed all around them, veins of light pulsing through conduits like arteries of a mechanical god. Thorn tapped his wrist pad, launching a loop that temporarily blinded the sensors. 3 minutes. Move. They split into pairs, Vixa staying back to monitor the loop integrity. Rhett and Aelira climbed a narrow shaft lined with coolant pipes, emerging into the command floor just as the operators rotated shifts. There, Aelira whispered, pointing to a crystalline core suspended above a pool of radiant energy. That's the modulator. Rhett nodded. Let's fry it. They approached fast, placing magnetic charges along the stabilizers. Thorn's voice crackled in Rhett's earpiece. All units, 30 seconds. Then full sync. That's when the alarm screamed. We've been burned. Vixa's voice was sharp, panicked. Someone tripped the secondary grid. It wasn't us. Kale. The realization hit like a fist. Rhett spun, but it was too late. Kale emerged from the side access corridor, flanked by enforcers. He held up a clearance key, tossed it at the feet of the guards. Told you I'd deliver them. I want the deal. The guards moved in, but Rhett and Aelira were already reacting. Smoke grenades exploded from her belt, obscuring the vision. They dove behind the console, returning fire with repurposed plasma tools. The control core flickered, destabilized by the initial charges. Thorn. Detonate now. We'll all die if I do. Do it anyway? Vixa's scream cut through the comms. I'm hit. Aelira froze. Rhett cursed and vaulted over the console, grabbing Vixa's bleeding body as she collapsed. A burn across her side hissed with acidic plasma. He dragged her behind cover, heart pounding. Aelira joined him, pressing a field patch against the wound. We need to pull out, she shouted. Rhett shook his head, fury rising in his throat. His eyes burned holes through Kale, who now retreated behind the guards. He sold us, Rhett growled. For a seat at their table. That's what they do, Aelira whispered. They make you think the only way to survive is to kneel. Thorn's voice returned, tight with urgency. We can still take out the secondary array. It won't destroy the system, but it will blind the arena's viewports. Enough to cause panic. Enough to give us a window. Rhett looked down at Vixa. Her eyes fluttered open. Do it, she croaked. Make it mean something. He nodded, then to Aelira, get her out. I'll finish it. You're not dying on me? Then come back and pull me out. She hesitated, then pressed her forehead to his. No kiss. Just breath and memory. She vanished into the smoke with Vixa in her arms. Rhett surged toward the array, slamming the last charge into place. Alarms wailed. Drones swarmed. Plasma fire burned around him. He hit the trigger. The explosion was surgical, shattering the modulator. Sparks and energy flooded the spire. Screens blinked out across the arena. Holograms collapsed midair. The illusion broke. And the world above began to scream. Rhett stumbled out of the wreckage as the emergency shutters slammed shut behind him. He was bleeding, singed, but alive. Aelira was waiting at the bottom of the shaft, Vixa breathing but unconscious beside her. He collapsed beside them. We didn't destroy the Empire, he said. No, Aelira replied. But we made it bleed. And for the first time, they felt the wind shift. They thought blood was the end. We will show them it is only the beginning. The grand arena trembled with anticipation. Towers of flame erupted along the outer walls, synchronized with a roar of crowds that spanned dozens of species, languages, and allegiances. It was the Festival of Dominion, the largest, most watched blood sport event of the Varianese calendar. Every screen in the system beamed toward the Temple of the Old Gods. Inside the stone and metal Colosseum, Rhett and Aelira stood in one of 6 gates carved into the walls, facing the arena sands. Around them, the other 4 fighters paced, champions from other systems, their armor polished, their reputations carefully curated. There was the Urgan Bone Flayer from Threx Prime, the twin assassins from Silkar, and a monstrous brute in crimson synth-plate armor known only as Bragg. They were meant to be allies. They don't look like friends, Rhett murmured. Aelira's eyes, silver-violet, flicked across the competitors. Because they are not. This isn't a battle. It's a purge. The gates opened. The crowd erupted. Blinding light from twin suns poured into the arena. The 6 fighters stepped into the sand as the announcer's voice thundered in the sky. Witness the convergence of power. The finest warriors from across the stars. Let their blood consecrate our glory. The moment their feet touched the center circle, everything changed. Bragg struck first. He lunged at Rhett with shocking speed for his size, plasma axe aimed for Rhett's neck. Rhett ducked, rolled, and came up with a dagger he'd palmed earlier. Before he could counter, one of the Silkar twins flipped in, launching twin plasma daggers at Aelira. She twisted, catching one blade with her vambrace, the second grazing her ribs. Blood bloomed. Rhett charged the twin, only to be intercepted by Bone Flayer, who shrieked with ultrasonic rage and lashed out with spined limbs. They were surrounded. Hunted. They were never allies, Aelira shouted as she drove her knee into the twin's throat. They were sent to kill us. Above the chaos, high in the broadcast towers, Thorn moved. He inserted the worm code into the system, disguised as a diagnostics patch. The moment it deployed, feeds began to shudder. Across Varianese, screens flickered. And then, the illusion shattered. Holograms of valor and glory were replaced by raw, unedited footage, children being dragged into training pens, slaves implanted with neural leashes, failed gladiators executed off-screen. Screams. Blood. Torture. The audience gasped. Then went silent. Inside the arena, the chaos turned. Bone Flayer faltered, distracted by the holograms now flickering in the sky. One of the Silkar assassins stopped moving, confusion on her face. Aelira seized the moment and drove her blade into the assassin's abdomen. Rhett slammed Bragg into the arena wall, his fist meeting armor, over and over. Then came the tremor. The arena shook. The sands quivered. A voice echoed from the heavens, amplified through the arena speakers. So be it. If truth has been unleashed, let myth return. Terrell Voss. He emerged from a platform above the arena, arms outstretched, surrounded by drones. But he did not speak again. Instead, he unleashed Varaxian. The arena floor opened like a maw. From below rose a thing not born but forged, a biomechanical colossus, 30 feet tall, bristling with obsidian armor and living AI tendrils. Its eyes glowed like neutron stars, and its roar shook the Colosseum. Varaxian was Terrell's final ace. Aelira froze for a heartbeat. He's releasing a myth. Rhett cracked his neck. Then let's become legends. They ran together. The surviving gladiators fled. Even Bone Flayer turned and bolted. But Rhett and Aelira advanced. Varaxian swung a tail made of carbon-linked blades, cutting a swath through the arena. Rhett rolled beneath it, stabbing upward into a joint. Sparks flew, but the beast barely reacted. Its pain receptors are mapped synthetically, Aelira shouted. Target the neural cores. Where? Look for pulse clusters. Back of the head, base of the spine. Rhett signaled Thorn through the comms. Tell me how to blind this thing. Thorn replied, breathless, there's a light sync override. You'll need to plant a spike on its spine. 5 seconds of access before it purges. Aelira moved first. She sprinted along a fallen column, launched herself onto Varaxian's back, and drove the spike into the port beneath its dorsal ridge. Rhett leapt after her, climbing through its armor plates. The override activated. Varaxian spasmed. Its visual feed glitched. For a window of seconds, it was blind. Now! Thorn shouted. Rhett punched through the access hatch, slamming a blast core into the processor node. Aelira leapt clear. The explosion was surgical. Controlled. Varaxian's head jolted violently, half its neural network severed. The Colossus toppled with a groan that echoed like thunder. Silence. Then the crowd began to scream. But not for blood. For freedom. Above the arena, systems collapsed. Screens turned to static. Drones fell. The illusion was dead. Terrell Voss stood on his platform, unmoving. His face a mask of disbelief. Rhett stared up at him. Bloody, bruised, but standing. Aelira stepped beside him, her voice raw. It begins. From the stands, fighters began to rise. Not to fight, but to climb. Toward the walls. Toward the towers. Toward the chains that once held them. And Varianese trembled under the weight of its own sins. Surviving is not victory. What you choose to do afterward is. The arena groaned like a dying beast. Chunks of the upper tiers collapsed in a rain of stone and metal. The massive carcass of Roxian still steamed where it lay, its shattered AI cores crackling and sputtering like broken stars. Smoke billowed across the sands, blotting out the view of the stands now teeming with movement. Chaos had replaced ceremony. The grand arena, once the symbol of absolute control, was crumbling. Rhett stumbled through the dust, one arm pressed to his ribs. Blood seeped through his armor, each breath a jagged knife. But he kept moving, eyes searching for Aelira. She was on her knees beside Vixa, shielding the girl from falling debris. Her hair clung to her face in sweat and blood, but her eyes still burning with that violet fire locked onto Rhett the moment he limped into view. She stood quickly, helping Vixa to her feet. Together, they ran to him. Before they could speak, the air shimmered. Terrell Voss descended. Not on a platform, not flanked by drones but alone. He stepped down a collapsing stair of light, his metallic limbs hissing with calculated precision. His human eye burned with rage, his synthetic one glowed cold with purpose. He didn't speak at first. He merely looked down at Roxian, then at Rhett and Aelira. His lips curled in disdain. You think this is victory? Aelira took a step forward, but Rhett caught her arm. Let him talk. Terrell gestured to the shattered arena. This spectacle is meaningless. You've broken a stage, not a system. The galaxy runs on fear, not hope. You think these people will rise? They will scatter. You are sparks in a storm. And the storm will drown you. He raised one hand, and a pulse rippled outward. From hidden hatches across the arena floor, auto turrets emerged, rotating toward the trio. Rhett barely had time to curse. Then a figure leapt between them and the guns. Kale. He had no weapon, only a scavenged shield strapped to his arm and a stolen energy core clutched in the other. His face was a storm of regret and resolve. Run. He slammed the core into the nearest turret. The explosion shredded the turret and Kale with it. Silence followed. Then more turrets hissed to life. Vixa screamed. Aelira moved on instinct, pulling Rhett and Vixa behind a fallen slab of Roxian's armor. They were pinned. Rhett pressed a hand to his bleeding side. We're out of time. Aelira looked toward Terrell, who stood beyond the rising smoke. Her jaw tightened. Something in her shifted, something ancient, something locked away for too long. She stood. Aelira. Rhett tried to rise, but pain stopped him. What are you doing? She didn't answer. She walked into the open. Terrell raised a hand to signal the turrets. And then she screamed. But it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a sound like resonance and thunder, a frequency that bent metal and split light. The air rippled. The turrets froze, their circuits overloaded. Sparks flew from their cores. One by one, they collapsed, disabled. Terrell staggered. His synthetic eye flickered. Aelira glowed. Her veins shimmered with energy, her voice humming with alien vibration. Rhett, watching from behind cover, understood, this was her birthright. The legacy of her people, the secret buried beneath her exile. She unleashed the full force of her neural resonance. Terrell roared in defiance, charging her. His limbs expanded, weaponized, transforming into blades and cannons. But Aelira did not flinch. Her pulse wave struck him mid-charge, bending his form, distorting his shape. He reached her. They clashed. Rhett, barely standing, threw himself into the fray, shoulder-checking Terrell from the side. The three of them tumbled in a blur of sparks and screaming metal. Pain screamed through Rhett's spine. He couldn't breathe. But he forced his hand up, clutching the detonator embedded in his glove, a last trick wired to Varaxian's residual core. Terrell grabbed him by the throat. "You are nothing." Aelira placed her hand on Terrell's chest. "No," she whispered. "He is the reason you've already lost." She triggered the final burst of resonance. Rhett activated the core. The blast was blinding. Sound vanished. The world inverted. When Rhett came to, the sky above was filled with ash and stars. The arena was rubble. Varaxian's remains were gone. Terrell's broken body lay smoldering beside him, twitching once before falling still. Aelira knelt over him, her forehead pressed to his. "We did it," she said. "Did we win?" he asked, voice hoarse. She smiled faintly. "We survived. Now we decide what that means." From the ruins, others emerged. Fighters. Prisoners. Survivors. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They looked at Rhett and Aelira, and waited. Not for orders. For direction. Because surviving was not enough. It was time to build something worth surviving for. There were no more spectators. No more fences. Only the choice, to rebuild, or to remain in chains. Terrell's body lay broken beneath a pile of twisted metal and scorched stone, but his voice still crackled faintly through the broken comms embedded in his mechanical skull. Rhett could barely hear it through the ringing in his ears and the pain radiating through his torso. Aelira stood above the wreckage, her armor scorched, her face set with resolve. Around them, the arena had collapsed into a crater of ash and sparks, smoke billowing into the alien sky. Then the floor beneath them rumbled. Terrell had one last fail-safe. A cascade of deep, rhythmic pulses activated from below the foundation of the arena itself, humming with a low, rising frequency. Aelira's eyes widened. "He's triggering a full system collapse," she said. Rhett forced himself to his feet. A chain reaction. The modulator cores below the ground. "He's going to bury the whole city." Terrell moved again, barely. His mechanical arm twitched toward the device embedded in his chest. Rhett lunged and slammed his own body onto Terrell's, locking him in place. The energy surged. "Go!" Rhett shouted to Aelira. "Take Vixa and the others. Get clear. I'm not leaving you. You have to finish this. Get them out." Aelira hesitated, eyes full of fire and sorrow. Then she ran. Rhett gritted his teeth, forcing Terrell down, every muscle screaming. The energy pulsed beneath him like a living heart ready to rupture. He closed his eyes. But the end didn't come. A sudden, searing light engulfed them, and a shock of cold pierced his chest. Rhett gasped, not in pain, but in suspended animation. Thorn stood above him, holding a cylindrical device shimmering with blue light. The old engineer's face was pale, his hands shaking. "Prototype Regenfield," Thorn muttered. "Bad tech. No time for ethics." The blast had been contained. The chain reaction halted. The system had burned itself out. Aelira returned minutes later, breathless, Vixa and a group of surviving fighters at her side. She dropped to her knees beside Rhett. He was alive. Not whole. Not healed. But alive. News of the uprising spread faster than any regime could contain. Thorn had hardwired the final pulse of the arena into the galactic network. Billions across the stars watched in real time as the grand arena fell not to fire, not to siege, but to defiance. The footage of Terrell's fall. Of Roxian's death. Of Rhett and Aelira standing side by side, battered but unbroken. The Council of Systems was forced to act. Varianese was declared a restricted zone. The gladiator circuits were outlawed. In dozens of planets, prison arenas were torn down. Underground resistance groups found hope in a symbol. The Flame and the Chain Breaker. That was what the galaxy named them. But for Rhett and Aelira, titles meant little. They remained on Varianese until the fires died. Help came eventually. Supplies. Aid workers. Historians. Politicians. But Rhett stayed clear of the platforms. And Aelira refused to speak to any council member. Their war had never been for glory. On the final night before they left the ruins, Rhett and Aelira stood on the outer ridge of the crater where the arena had once towered. Wind swept across the scorched earth, carrying with it the silence of something finished. "It doesn't feel like a victory," Rhett said. Aelira slipped her hand into his. "That's because it's not the end." They stood in silence. The stars above flickered. The moons of Varianese cast a soft blue glow across the ruins. In the distance, survivors lit small fires. Not for battle, but to gather, to remember, and to begin. When they finally walked away, it wasn't with a posture of warriors or saviors. It was simply two people moving forward. Together. No more arena. No more chains. Only the choice to rebuild something better.